We're up and running.
There we go. Evening, everybody. My name is Nathan Kelby. I am the open space coordinator for a city and county in Broomfield. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about native plants for Colorado landscaping. A little bit about myself. I have multiple degrees in forestry. I've been around since, 1996, so I'm aging myself. Just so you know, I'm a pretty informal speaker. I will be including you guys in the presentation. I'll be asking questions of you, just because I feel like basically engaging the audience is probably the best way to get them involved in what we're talking about. So anytime you feel like chiming in, feel free to do so and ask questions as well. Like I said, I'm pretty informal. So if I am covering it on a slide later on, I will let you know that and move on to the next slide. I'm not trying to be rude, just know that I'm probably covering that in a later slide. So anyway, with any further ado, I will start the presentation. And the first question is, why plant native? And the first question I always ask is, I always take the historical picture on the right and I look at it and I ask the audience, what are the big things that are missing from the one above and the one below? And I usually look for answers at this point, but I know there's only one of you, so you can feel free to chime in if you'd like. But you can kind of see from the old photo, which was at the turn of the 19th century, that there weren't a whole heck of a lot of trees. Basically, the Boulder Valley was basically sparsely vegetated, and most of it was prairie. And it's changed over time in the way that we look at it and think about it. But what was originally here is basically, short grass prairie. And I try and point that out because that's really what this region was meant to support. As a forester, it's been, it's hard for me. I'm a tree guy, but basically smaller plants and grasses were what this environment was truly meant to represent. So why plant native? All these plants are adapted to the conditions, the soil, the water, the wind, the temperatures, the extremes that we experience here in the Front Range. All these plants that were here naturally occurring, basically they were meant to do so, and they are adapted to this environment extremely well. It reduces our overall water use, which is one of the key factors. It creates many habitats for native fauna. So the picture that I took before was yellow stonecrop, and I'll be covering that plant in this presentation. But that was taken in my own garden, and that's a little native sweat bee that was in my front yard. I don't know how many years ago, but basically, I've created this kind of environment in my own garden out front. Again, why plant native? It reduced our pesticide and fertilizer use. When things are adapted to the environment, they're used to the fungi, insects, and other diseases and insects and other things that are going on in the environment that are present, and they're resistant to them. So it reduces overall pesticide and fertilizer use. Now the question is, should you plant any native Colorado plant in Broomfield? And really the answer is no. And the reason why is because of our mountains, we have multiple zones of plant zone ecosystems. We have the plain zone ecosystem, which is where we are. And then you get into the foothills, which is closer. As you go to Boulder, you'd be kind of getting into right where the mountains begin to start, where you get pinyon, gamble, and plum. Basically, pinyon and gamble is more of a southern species, Front Range. Usually along here, we kind of see a direct transition from prairie directly up into the montane zone, mainly in the Boulder area, and we see it go directly from short grass and long grass and tall grass prairie up into Ponderosa and Douglas fir. That's pretty normal. As you go higher, you get into the subalpine zone, which is Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. And then we get into the tundra where basically that's above tree line. And we're going to talk about a couple plants that actually coexist all the way from the plains all the way up to the tundra zone, which is kind of interesting. And that's why I respect a lot of these plants. They can survive a lot of different conditions, a lot of different temperatures, a lot of different regimes. And as of now, after living here for a long time, I've seen a lot of different things occur on the prairie. And I'll kind of talk about those a little bit. But as elevation changes and aspect changes, so does plant life. I will say aspect is a big thing for me. I think you really need to think about it when you are planting. My house faces west. I take that into account, and based on what I'm planting in my backyard and my back garden as opposed to my front. Stuff that's out front that's east facing doesn't really deal with the temperatures that my backyard deals with. And you can see that when you drive up Boulder Canyon. If you look on the right side, on the north side of the road, or on any south facing slope in the foothills, you'll see that you're going to get a lot of ponderosa. And then on the south side, on those north facing slopes, you're going to see a lot more Doug fir. You're going to see maybe a little bit of Engelmann spruce a little bit lower as you get closer to the subalpine zone. And basically, it's just aspect is a big part of it as well. You have to remember that with the mountains involved. So, I mean, this is all due to changes in temperature, precipitation, soil, slope, and exposure. So planting and maintenance, using natives will reduce maintenance needs, water requirements, fertilizing, pesticide use, but it's still a planned manicured area. You still have to kind of plan for it. It's just because you plant native does not mean that it's automatically going to be a hands-off garden. There's things that you can do to enhance it. There's things you're going to have to do. There's always things that have to be managed in a manicured landscape. So planning, when you are planning out your garden and with natives in mind, you need to consider these factors. Precipitation. So water is needed during establishment, but once we've got establishment, you can really back off of the water a lot. Overwatering is generally the biggest issue that I see. Prior to getting a job with the city and county of Broomfield in 2007, I worked for tree care services in the area. And the biggest issue that I saw with a lot of our drought tolerant species was overwatering. A lot of people overwatering their pinyon pines and their ponderosa pines. And stuff that is really actually adapted to the environment. They really don't need it once they're established. And that was one of the biggest problems that I generally saw when I was on the job. The soil, these plants like existing soil conditions that are present in the area, but sometimes amendments need to be made. The other thing I try to point out with the soil too is it was originally a prairie soil. If you were to be here 200 years ago, what you would have seen was probably, a similar picture to what you see without the buildings on that first slide, without the buildings, but basically just a short grass prairie. But the thing is basically we had built up an organic layer of soil that was probably about 12 to 18 inches deep. But basically over time, that's been kind of decimated by agricultural use, by other uses, by urban soils and things like that. So I've kind of changed my mind on this a little bit in that, yes, we need soil. And I used to kind of say that you can plant any of your native plants anywhere here, but I've kind of backed off on that a little bit. You do need organic material. You do need some sort of base material for them to go off of. And then aspect, I already touched on this. Which side of the house are you planning on? Also take into account, are there large shade trees? Look at that when you're dealing with with where you're planting. And how do you plan on cultivating? Are you basically going to use nursery stock? Are you going to use seed? Are you going to do both? And how you work and how you deal with your garden is just everybody's different, but most people will go to nursery stock. And then the other biggest problem I always encountered is research your plant characteristics, size, spread, and height, the size of it, the spread of it, and the height of it. That was another one of the biggest problems I would see consistently on a regular basis, is people planting the wrong plant in the wrong spot. I've seen so many homeowners, and I show up at their house in the past, and basically they've got a blue spruce, 10 feet from their front door. And I tell them immediately, like, they need to move that. And they don't understand why. And I point across the street to a 70-foot tall blue spruce, because that's going to turn into that. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of people don't think about when they are planting. A lot of what I see is overplanting. And then what happens is about 5-10 years down the road, usually about 5 years with a lot of these kind of plants, people are yanking stuff out and getting rid of it because basically their garden's overgrown. And then the big one is weeds. I will be giving a presentation about weeds tomorrow, so I will answer some questions on weeds tonight, but more can be derived tomorrow night from the noxious weed presentation that I get, because I'm not only am I the open space coordinator, I'm the noxious weed coordinator for Broomfield County as well. So weeds, it's something we all deal with. Try to control them prior to planting. Pull them, dig them up, make sure you get all of it if you're trying to go that route. It's not easy. It's extremely difficult on a large acreage basis. But on a smaller acreage basis with smaller homes and smaller gardens, you can overcome it. Smother them. Mulch tends to help. Another substance. A lot of people, what you'll see around here is they put down black plastic. It's temporary. What they're trying to do, they'll cover an entire area of their garden with black plastic for a good long portion of the year. And what they're trying to do is basically zap all the moisture out of there and kill any of the weeds that are present in that area. A lot of people will do it for an entire year sometimes. I haven't seen that as much lately, but it is a method you can use. It just basically decimates the weeds in the area, and then the next year people will start planting. And then you have the obvious alternative of spraying them. That is an option. It's always out there. I know a lot of people don't like it. I'll cover a little bit of that tomorrow night, and I'll answer more questions tonight if you have them about weeds, but I'd like to concentrate on weeds for tomorrow night if possible. Used to give these two topics conjunctively together, back to back, and it usually just takes too long. And some people are there for weeds, some people are there for the native planting. So I've separated them now. And then soil, we talked about this a little bit. You do not by any means need what is pictured here in this picture. We do not have soils like that. I grew up in Illinois. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, far west suburbs, and every year the farmers used to turn over their fields, and literally that's what it's looked like. That's what it used to look like. Rich, deep, black organic material. That's not what we have here, even though we do have organic material here in areas that have been untouched. But if you were to turn it over, it would only last a couple of years, and that's where the issue comes in. But most native plants don't need nutrient-rich, high organic like what we see here. They may require well-drained soils. We have I will say our soils vary from place to place significantly. You can, in my own yard, I've been digging and gone 10 feet the other way and encountered completely different soils. That's just part of what's here. We have elevated water tables. There's lots of weird things going on actually along the Front Range. with the soils. So, but they may not need nutrient rich, but they will require some well-drained soils. And then amendments, if you've got a really high clay soil, you might want to amend it 10% with compost and 15% with small aggregate. And pea gravel or crushed refines will work. Those will both work relatively well. With sandy or rocky soils, you don't need to add nearly as much. They tend to be more nutrient rich, and usually it's about a 3% addition of compost, maybe a little bit more, depending upon how rocky or sandy we're talking about. And then maintenance on top of that too, mulch. I highly recommend mulch, A, for weeds, but B, for moisture retention. It also will eventually add organic material to your soils as the mulch tends to break down. No fabric. We don't use fabric. The horticulture department within the parks department took fabric out of their standards and specifications probably just before I got there in 2007, because what they found is overall it really doesn't do much, and it actually breaks up the cycle of adding organic material from the mulch into the soil. And eventually what happens is weeds just the mulch breaks down, and then the organics basically tend to hang out right on top of that fabric, and then you get a ton of weeds growing on top of the fabric, which is difficult and costly to deal with. So that's why we took it out.
I have a quick question. Is now a good time to ask?
Sure.
It's more about the soil slide that you just had. I just have a question about the I guess issues surrounding like runoff and fertilizer, especially for native plants.
Yep.
I mean, you said earlier that less fertilizer would be used, but is there still a certain amount of fertilizer that needs to be used, especially when grown in like a front yard and stuff, aside from compost?
No, what I would say is if you're adding compost, you're doing exactly what's needed. The biggest thing, and what I've learned over the years is basically I've got some properties that have really honestly, for all intents and purposes, been untouched, and they're still basically remnant prairie. And what I've found is when I dig down in them, the first 12 inches is rich in organic material, and that's why the plant life is so rich and diverse, and why it's doing so well, even during dry and hot years. But basically, I think the fertilizers, what I would say is most of what's going to happen with that. Yeah, it might get taken up by the plant initially, but I think the organics are far more important than any sort of fertilizer that you want to put down. Now, for your grasses or for your stuff for your grass or for your trees, yeah, the fertilizer is going to be important, because basically with our clay soils, it's very difficult for those species that aren't supposed to be here to deal with that. But I would say that would be the biggest thing for me, is making sure you're amending the soil. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
Yep. I'm a big fan of rocks. My wife is too. I basically tend to use them, and sometimes they make really good additions in your gardens, and your plants really tolerate them very well. Like I think Prairie Zinnia is one of the ones that I go over in this one, but basically they do advise with some of these, like basically they like a really hot environment. They don't like a lot of moisture. So sometimes rocks are actually a good addition. It just depends from plant to plant, but I'm a big fan of rocks because basically it's kind of an easy way to add structure and beauty to your garden. And it just tends to work well with the native plants that we're dealing with. And then pruning, with some of this stuff with your trees and your shrubs, there may be little, but with good planning, you really shouldn't have to do much. It just depends on where you place it. I think good placement is the key to that. And then making sure that you're trying to figure out, well, what's my maximum height? What's my maximum spread, and dealing with that. And that should reduce your pruning as far as that's concerned. And then deadheading. Some of the native plants will respond to this. If you want to have them continue flowering, you should be deadheading them after the flowers have turned to seed heads. I would say remove them, and you might get another flush of flowers. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. And then weeding, I can't say it enough, keep up. And then usually what I say about irrigation is irrigate for establishment and drought. My gardens are wrap around my house from the front to the back, facing east, north, and south. They're all native and xeric plants. And to be honest with you, I irrigated them a little bit last summer when it was really, really hot. I put them on for about 20 minutes a week. Sometimes 30, just depended on how much. But basically, in a wet year, I don't irrigate them whatsoever at all. So you can get away with that, and it does work. You just kind of have to manage it and just keep track of what's going on and what kind of precipitation we're getting. Native plant materials. So we have herbaceous plant materials, which are non-woody, which are flowers. They can be perennial, annual, or biennial. Most of them are going to be perennial, obviously. When I say herbaceous and not woody, what this means is those plants basically die back to the ground level every year, and they don't have any woody content to them. And then they come back in the spring of the next year and start forming flowers or plant material. Basically your branches, your leaves, and things like that from the ground up again. Shrubs are woody plants 10 feet tall or less when mature, and then trees are woody plants 10 feet or more when mature. And I'm going to cover some of these as we go forward. I'll cover both herbaceous shrubs and trees. I'm kind of skimming the surface, and I can get you more information on this stuff. And by no means do I consider myself, I would say, a botanist or a plant expert on everything that's native. I think I have a good knowledge of what's going on. I've met a lot of people that have a lot better understanding of it, but I can help you out with a lot of the stuff that you can probably find commercially along the Front Range. So just to start with, I start with the forbs because that's what most people tend to want to hear about. I get a lot more questions from the trees and the shrubs because it becomes more difficult. Again, remember, I'm coming from a background where the way that I look at this is I look at that first picture that I showed you, in that basically we were a shortgrass prairie and now we've converted it to something completely different. As I stare out my window and look at 40-foot tall blue spruces and honey locusts and other trees that are here that were never here in the past and wouldn't be here without irrigation. So, but I get a lot of questions on the forbs, and I'll have some links at the end that kind of lead you toward some CSU guides that can help you with more of the forbs, the trees, and the shrubs that are native to Colorado and what zones they live in. The first one, and this is one of my favorites, I like it a lot, is Acetum Lanciolatum, or yellow stonecrop. The picture there on the right, you can see it grows in some pretty hospitable conditions. It doesn't get very big. It's upright stalks of 6 to 8 inches. It has small yellow 5-petaled flowers. It's low growing, and it's really great for rock gardens or for borders, is how I tend to use it in my gardens, or in filler areas in between those that are extremely hot. It is a succulent, so you can see kind of those leaves there. They're not very big. They're actually, if you were to cut them in half, they're almost rounded, and they're designed that way in order to survive the temperatures we get. The reason they're rounded like that, and the reason succulents are the way they are, kind of, is to reduce the overall surface area of the of the leaves and the stalks, and so that they can actually retain more water. This is one of the ones that I told you about. I have extreme respect for that plant because that lower picture kind of shows it can grow anywhere from 5,000 to 14,000 feet within the state of Colorado. So you will see it. It'll do well down here, but it'll also do well at 14,000 feet. Now, am I saying you can grab plants from 14,000 feet and bring them down to here? No, you can't, but it does adapt somewhat well. But I think you got to remember where the plant came from. So the ones that are up higher are definitely more acclimated to that. But you can get this kind of look, and you can get those plants at 5,000 feet. It's attractive to native bees and butterflies. I get tons of bees and butterflies when these guys are basically flowering in my yard, and it flowers anywhere from June through August. It's one of my favorites just because, I think once you get it going, it kind of takes care of itself. It will spread, so you kind of got to watch it a little bit. I cover a lot of different things. I try to include texture too. That's why I include fringe sage in this presentation. I like to cover other stuff as well, stuff that you normally don't see. Artemisia Frigida. It has an aromatic silvery foliage, and it does, when you pick it, it smells like sage. It's an evergreen, which is nice. So you tend to keep that look year round. So it adds texture, color, and depth to your gardens year round. I call it a subshrub, and the flowers aren't showy. That upper picture is basically what the flowers look like. It likes full sun. As I said before, it's good for texture. But it's not a very showy plant, but when it's mixed with other things, it works really well. There's different varieties and cultivars of this. You've probably heard about or seen about. If you haven't, there's the seafoam fringe sage. It's a little bit different. It's a derivative of this. So they have cultivated and changed it a little bit. Yellow Prains primrose, Enothera serialatus. It's a composite perennial. And that picture is actually from open space. I took that lemon yellow flowers that are about 1 inch in diameter. Grows about 8 to 16 inches in height. Has very narrow leaves, as you can see from the lower picture. It blooms from spring to midsummer. It likes the open sun, and it's a really low water use plant. Usually when you have something that has narrow leaves like that, it's a pretty tough plant because it's trying to reduce its overall surface area. I include Penstemons in here. There's a lot of different Penstemons. I can tell you that right now. The one I'm covering here is tall Penstemon, Penstemon vertigus. But there's a lot of different varieties of Penstemons, both natively and cultivars wise, but I usually try to tend toward the natives. There's a lot of people that basically their whole garden is just full of Penstemon. They call them Penstemaniacs. But this one in particular, again, this is a picture from Broomfield County open space. It's about 24 inches in height. It has about a 12-inch spread, but you can see it's not like a dense spread. It's more of a it's not a dense, thick plant. The flowers are all arranged and tending toward one side. They're about 1 inch long. You've probably heard them called beard tongue as well. They're called that just because when you look at it, it does kind of look like a bearded tongue that comes out of there. And it flowers from June to July. I will admit I like the Penstemons a lot. I have got 3 or 4 different varieties in my own garden. I have this one and a couple others. It is really attractive for bees. If you're really into bees and you want to see bees and bumblebees and other things in your garden, Penstemons are always a great way to go. And this is one that I picked up on about, I planted it in my own garden about 5 or 6 years ago. Antonia Rosia, it's pink pussy toes. It's not a very tall plant, mature height of 4 to 12 inches. The max height I think I've gotten in my own garden has been probably about 9. Its mature spread is 8 to 12 inches. And the reason I love this plant so much is because when they say mature spread of 8 to 12 inches, I planted it and it started to spread. And I was like, oh crap, it's going to get out of control. And it did exactly what it said. It went to about 8 to 12 inches, maybe a little bit more. And basically it kind of just stopped. And I was kind of in shock because it actually did what it said it was going to do, which sometimes doesn't happen. But I think if you're giving it the right amount of water, it will do this for you. It tends to bloom in June. And the reason it's, it has a mat forming leaf that spreads through stolons. So a stolon is like a root, but it's above ground. Buffalo grass has stolons as well. So, but if you're giving it water, those stolons will basically start to spread out. And that's why I started to kind of freak out. I was kind of like, it's going to spread more. I saw the stolons going and I was like, this is going to get out of control and take over my garden. And it didn't. It kind of just stopped, it's just really nice. So if you plant it for the right area, it's going to stick to that area. A little bit more about it. It's great in rock gardens and in borders. Even after flowers are gone, that picture above, those are kind of the spent flower heads. And you can see it has a really nice texture and appearance to it, almost like a silvery motif to it. And it looks really nice. It's called pussy toes for that cat-like paw appearance in the flowers. So the one thing I always say about a lot of our native plants is if you're trying to find a native plant or you're looking at native plants, or when you are dealing with native plants, when you look at them, they tend to have a more sagey or a lighter green color. And you'll see this almost consistent throughout with a lot of the plants that are native to the Front Range and native to the short grass prairies of the Front Ranges. And the reason they are that lighter color is it attracts less heat, less sun and less heat. Therefore, you have less evaporation loss. And basically, it's an adaptation that you'll see throughout almost consistently throughout most, if not all of the native plants that occur along the Front Range. Pulsatilla patens. This is a pasque flower. I kind of call it our native tulip. If you were to go into the foothills, say it's a little later this year than normal, but if you were to go into the foothills and go for a hike in the foothills, say in April and May, what you'll see is, and I've got a picture of it in the foothills, is you'll see pasque flower coming up, and it's usually one of the first flowers to come up. It has really woolly foliage. It's 6 to 12 inches tall. It forms fuzzy seed heads, which are really actually nice after the plant is flowered. It's really it's kind of goofy looking, but I kind of like it. It's an early bloomer, like I said. It's April and May, and it's a multiple stem plant. And just so you have an idea, the picture on the left is taken in my own garden. I have about 4 or 5 of them planted in my own garden, and they're coming up right now. Basically, it's just the foliage. The flowers haven't come through yet because we've had so much snow. But then the picture on the right is actually taken from the foothills right up here in the Front Range. And that's generally what you'll see of it coming up when you start to see the plant flowering in the foothills. That's kind of what you'll see. But on the left-hand side, you can see those fuzzy, kind of goofy looking seed heads. And that's why I took that picture, because as I wanted people to see the flower heads as well as the seed heads, because I almost think it looks like a truffula tree from the Lorax, in my opinion. So that's kind of what I gave you right there, is kind of a snippet of a decent variety of native plants. But a lot of those come up at different times, and that's why I kind of did it that way. So you have something to go off of. When I plant my gardens and when you're planting it, when you are deciding on stuff, you should try and get flushes of stuff that are going to be spring, summer, and then late summer and fall blooming, so that you're constantly having stuff in your garden come up in a way that it's always showy to some degree. And usually people like that. I'm not going to lie, the hardest part of the year to get stuff to grow in and to have stuff flowering is probably August, late July, August, and early September. You can't do it. It just depends on what you plant and how tough the plants are. And I try and do that with the flowers because that's what most people want to see out of their gardens. As far as shrubs go, I will cover some. We're going to cover shrubs, trees, and then I'm going to cover some grasses too, because I feel like that's an undervalued thing. I'm a big grass fan. I think you can do a lot with grasses, and I think it adds a lot to your garden. As far as shrubs go, one of the big ones I like a lot is Chrysanthemum nauseosus, which is rabbit brush. You've probably seen it. It's 2 to 6 feet in mature height. They do make a dwarf variety of this as well. And it is native. So it's a little bit smaller. It's probably like anywhere from 2 to 4 feet in mature spread, in mature height. And then the regular one is 2 to 4 feet in mature spread. And the smaller one's probably more like 1 to 2 feet in mature spread. So when you are looking at them, just know what you're looking at. There is a dwarf variety that's out there. It has yellow composite flowers. It has a blue-green foliage associated with it. So again, like I was saying, a lot of our native plants have that blue-green or muted green foliage associated with it. It likes dry sites from 5,000 to 9,000 feet. It attracts native insects, and it's a late summer bloomer. So I'd point that out. It's not going to come out until late summer. 3-leaf sumac or skunk bush, Rhus trilobata. Its mature height's about 3 to 5 feet. Its mature spread is rather large. It can get pretty big, so just be aware of that, 8 to 10 feet. You can keep that under control if you want to. If you like it enough, you can actually prune it or reduce it back and keep it to a smaller height. If you got questions about how to do that, I can let you know. It has small yellow flowers. It's really not meant for its showy flowers. What it's really meant for is more for its texture and its color. The foliage is glossy. It has a 3-lobed leaf that's red in the fall, as you can see from that picture below. The fruit, it has small red edible berries. So if you're into birds, you can plant this in the backyard. And in the fall, you'll get birds and mammals eating those if you want those. The other thing I point out too, though, is it is called skunk bush for a reason. The minute you start trimming it, it does have a pungent odor to it. Anytime the horticulture crews have been out trimming it and they come back, generally, because literally they smell like it if they've been outside trimming it all day. So just be aware of that. It doesn't smell unless you've trimmed it. I mean, you can plant it, but if you're planning on using it, just be aware that if you're going to have to be trimming it and pruning it to keep it at a certain size, it does have a pungent odor to it. This is one of my favorites. The first time I ever encountered it was when I was living in Salt Lake City in about 1997. It's Circocarpus Mountainous. It's mountain mahogany. Not a very showy plant, but it does really well in really arid, dry environments, as you can see from that picture above. The picture below is kind of what you'll encounter in the nursery. Has a mature height about 8 feet. I have seen it grow larger than that. Again, if you're giving it too much water, it's going to tend to grow larger. But if you're getting it established and letting it grow at its natural pace, its mature height's going to be about 8 feet, 9 feet. Mature spread of anywhere of about 6 feet. It is an evergreen, but it will drop its leaves during drought conditions during the summer and in the winter. Usually it happens more in the winter when we're experiencing really, really dry periods. It'll just kind of lose its leaves. Doesn't mean the plant's dead. It just means basically it's It can't support those leaves anymore, and it'll push out a new flush of leaves come spring. It likes dry, rocky slopes from 4,500 to 9,000 feet. There's more than one species of mahogany present in the area. It does tend to do better in the foothills region, but like basically based on our planting conditions here, it's something I always point out that you can use in your garden. Has small yellow flowers that aren't very showy. One of the reasons I like this one a lot is the feather-like elongated style. It's a feather-like appendage that is attached to the fruit after the flowers have gone to seed, and you can see that in the picture below. I think that personally is a better addition than the flowers itself. I've seen the flowers live and in person. They're pretty, but they're not. I just think those feathery appendages actually are more what I go for, and it kind of it's got that soft, nice appearance to it when they are there. And then just so you know, it is North America's most dense wood. So it's a pretty thick, heavily weighted tree. I have, cut it down and then like cut it into slivers, and it's a very dense wood. And trees, I'm moving on to trees. I always point out, again, trees here are difficult. I'm really in all honesty, the Denver metro area, there really weren't a lot of trees here 200 years ago like there are now. It was mostly prairie. Most of the trees that we had were probably along the creeks and on elevated water tables and near springs and things like that. Because that's where they could survive. You had a lot of open land, not a lot of dense forested vegetation at all, if almost none at all. And that's kind of what I usually point out is trees are difficult here, but you can work with it. And some of the ones that I cover in here will do better for you. But again, they're not really intended for the prairie. So it is kind of difficult to get them going, but once you do, they're better adapted to the area. But they're not. There's really no one tree that I can say, is it present in the prairies that occurred around here? Probably not. One of them was gamble oak, and this is a great species. It's really not truly native to this region. It tends to be, if you head south of Colorado Springs and in the Springs area, you tend to see it more. We don't really have it here. As you head south of Denver, it starts to appear. But Quercus gambleri, gamble oak, or scrub oak, as most people call it, has a mature height of about 10 to 25 feet, mature spread of about 10 to 20 feet. The leaves are lobed and entire, so it's a member of the white oak family, actually. It's extremely slow growing. So when you think about that 10 to 25 feet, what I usually tell people is if you're getting growth rates of a half inch to an inch per year, that's about normal. That's what you're kind of looking for. So it is an extremely slow growing species. So just as an example, like that plant on the bottom, that tree on the bottom there, that's probably mature height and spread, and it's probably well over 150 years old. So when you think about age, don't always think about size. Some of the oldest living organisms on Earth, which are Bristlecone Pines. One of them, I think they cut it down by accident, a grad student did, and he brought it back, and I think he actually quit over it because he cut down a 4,000-year-old tree, but it was probably only about 8 to 12 inches in diameter. Continued on with gamble oak. The acorns are good for wildlife. You get a nice red, orange, and yellow and brown foliage in the fall. That's where the reds and the oranges come from down south, and up near Steamboat Springs. That's what you're getting the red and orange from generally. Another one I cover in here too is thin leaf alder, Ulmus tenuifolium. Generally, what I point out with this one is it's a large shrub or a small tree. It's generally multi-stemmed. It grows from 5,000 to 10,000 feet. It likes sun to part shade. So you have to be a little careful with it. You're not going to want to grow it in the open to some degree. It has grayish smooth bark. And I usually point out it's going to require a little bit more water, but not nearly as much as a lot of the non-native trees that we have around here, because it generally tends to grow along stream banks and in ravines and things like that where water tends to collect. Another one is pinyon pine, Pinus edulis, mature height again of about 20 to 30 feet, mature spread of 10 to 15. I've seen larger than that though. I'm not in total agreement with that. It is, there's two needled, it's a two needle pine. There is a single needle pinyon too as well, which is probably available, but if you want the native, you want to look at Pinus edulis, which is two needled. It has a stocky growth habit, and this is where pine nuts come from. So if you ever wondered where those came from and why they're so darn expensive, this is basically where they come from. And like I said, that's the cone above, and then the picture below, basically what you're looking at is a plant that's probably can be anywhere from 150 to 300 to possibly more years old. So these trees are extremely slow growing. They're not going to grow fast on you. The biggest problem I encounter with these is people are overwatering them, and they're growing too fast, which can be problematic. And the reason it's problematic, and I'll point this out, is that what happens is if you're overwatering and it's growing, say, 2 to 3 inches a year, what happens is all the energy and all of the defense mechanisms that are going into 2 to 3 inches are being spread out. Normally it wants to grow at anywhere from a half inch to an inch and a half per year. And as it gets older, that decreases, obviously, as the plant gets older. So what happens is when you take what normally would be being watered and give it too much water and it's growing 3 inches, all the resources that it normally would have in a half inch or an inch of growth are being spread out over 3 inches. And that's why I used to see a lot of problems with the pinyons and with the next species as well too, the Ponderosa pine or Pinus ponderosa. It's a 3-needled pine. It can grow over 100 feet tall. 268 feet is the tallest. It has platy orange-red bark that smells like cream soda or vanilla, however you want to describe it. If you're ever up in the foothills in the spring, taking a hike, and you smell something that's cream soda-like or vanilla-like, it's probably the Ponderosa pines that you're hiking through. And I'll show you the bark in a minute. If you sniff that bark, I always mess with people that don't know their trees, and I tell them to smell it, and they think I'm nuts, but it does. It smells like vanilla or cream soda. You have spines and tipped umbels on the cones. And that's kind of the picture on the left is a picture of the spiny bark, or the reddish bark, platy bark, and then the spiny tipped umbels of the cones on the right. So grasses is the last thing I'll cover. This is one of my favorites. I've got it in my own garden out back, Sargassum Avanacium, or Indian grass. It is a clump grass. It has yellow spikelets. And to understand what the difference between a clump grass is and between our regular grass that grows, as you can see in the picture on the lower right, it tends to have a clump formation and grow that way. Whereas a lot of the other grasses that aren't clump grasses, that are either stolon or sod forming, they basically spread through rhizomes, through the root system underground or through above ground stolons. It has yellow spikelets, which is that picture above, green to red, then brown foliage. It's 2.5 feet to 5 feet tall. It's late summer flowering, or it's basically, we have cool and warm season grasses. And what that means is warm season grasses their spikelets and their flower heads tend to come out late summer, early fall, whereas your cool season grasses tend to come out in the springtime. Cytodes, grama, Budaloa, Curtipentula. Mature height of 1 to 2 feet. It spreads about 12 inches. Has a reddish flower spike in midsummer. So it's a cool season grass, and that's that picture on the lower right. The spikelets tend to form on one side, which is why they call it Curtipentula. It means basically one-sided. Little blue stem, Zachariam Scoparium. It's a warm season or late blooming grass. Tends to have a blue to purple stem early in the year. It's reddish in color, and it tends to be late, and it's 1 to 4 feet tall, and it spreads about 12 to 18 inches in height, in diameter. Another one is switchgrass, Panicum virgatum. Again, it's a warm season. The seed heads are in panicles, as you can see on the right, the upper left-hand side. It's kind of softer looking, and that's because the seed heads are in a panicle style where they have a lot of different branches leading to a singular seed head. It has green foliage, which is turns to a reddish hue, and then sometimes brownish in the fall. It has a very soft appearance, and it actually is soft to the touch, and it varies from 2 to 4 feet tall. If it's going over 4 feet tall, you're probably overwatering it more than likely. And this is one that's always overlooked, in my opinion. It's Idaho blue fescue, Festuca idahoensis. It's a cool season grass. It's short, 18 inches in total height, with a 10-inch spread. It has thread-like braids at the base. That's why it's actually used as a turf grass as well. There are a lot of fescue blend turf grasses out there. But I like it because it's not used as an ornamental very often, but I think it's something that could be used more. It has soft seed heads, as you can see from the picture, and it's bluish green in color. So it's not a very tall grass, so it can be used along borders in that manner. And then just as an example, I've used my own garden, which I've since expanded. I continue to try and chunk out and take more of my lawn away and expand it. But there's Pulsatilla patens in my own garden, again, past flower. I use it closer to the borders, and it basically tends to come out in the spring and then disappear, kind of like your tulips. This is one that I didn't cover. It's one of my favorites. It's Tradiscancia Occidentalis. It's Western spiderwort. Really, really pretty blue, three-petaled flowers. Really, really bright yellow stamens on it. And it is a monocot. It tends to get a little bit taller, and the flowers only last for 24 hours. They bloom once and then they're done. The nice thing is just because that flower only is there for 24-hour period, there's multiple flushes of flowers. And usually I would say it flowers for me for about a month in total. Monarda fistulosa, which is B-Balm. This is another good one. Not super showy, but I just think it's kind of goofy looking and pretty. Again, that's in my own garden. It doesn't tend to last very long, but it tends to attract a lot of bees, and sometimes it'll attract hummingbirds as well. Penstemon virens. This is a smaller penstemon that I have growing in my own garden. It is native. Probably gets about anywhere from 8 to 12 inches tall. It's just a really pretty flower. And it's just a smaller variety of the penstemon that I like to use in my presentation. Other information and sources, there's a lot of different places you can go. Colorado Native Plant Society, if you're interested, has a large list of nurseries in the Denver metro area. And basically that link right there, you can go to that and basically look at that and get information about them. CSU Extension. CSU Extension also has what's called the Native Plant Master Program. We currently don't have any Native Plant Master programs currently through Broomfield. It's something that in the future I'd like to approach and do. but I've gone through the Plant Master program through Jefferson County, which was where it was invented. And that's a good resource. It's a little bit of a drive, but I can tell you that the classes are great. I believe Boulder County has some, and some of the other county extensive extension units have a native plant master program as well. And then seeds, there's a couple different links there, and then there's another one there below. That's actually something, those are publications in relation to native plants, and different varieties, different, all sorts of different stuff. Like I said, I just skimmed the surface. There's a lot of botany out there. There's a lot to learn out there. I'm always constantly learning something new every year, but there's a lot of information out there. But as far as gardening goes, there's some really good publications that are produced by by Colorado State extension units that'll cover a lot of different categories. And that's all I have. And we don't have anybody else here. Oh, that sucked.